Okay, so this is my very brief introduction to the High Renaissance. It's really a continuation of what we saw in the early Renaissance, but I'm going to show you a few pieces that make you see, hopefully, kind of how styles develop into even greater naturalism. Um, when we talk about the High Renaissance, we're talking mostly about the 16th century, i.e., the 1500s, called the Cinquecento, as opposed to the Quattrocento for the 1400s, right? For the early Renaissance. So the High Renaissance continues that interest in the humanist ideals that I talked about with respect to the early Renaissance, right? But what we get is we get even greater realism in form and space, and they had in the High Renaissance linear perspective for a while, right? And what we'll see in High Renaissance work is it's still definitely a linear perspective, but it's not super rigid. The super rigid linear perspective that we often see during the early Renaissance. The High Renaissance, there's a little more freedom in what's portrayed while still following linear perspective. Let me show you what I mean. Well, I'll get to that in a second. So here we talk about the continuation of the revival of humanist ideals. So we talked about the David, right? Donatello's David, and its connection to humanism and the individual, et cetera, seems pretty obvious here. When people normally, or not normally, but often people, when they hear about the David and art, they think Michelangelo's David, which is a much larger piece and of marble. And which comes from what we generally call the High Renaissance. And so we see that the ideas of humanism continue, right? We still have a naked male figure there, right? Go. But when I talk about kind of freeing up from the kind of mathematically dominant linear perspective, this is what I'm talking about, right? This is a piece from, actually, I think it's from the Sistine Chapel, but this is in linear perspective, right? We can even see the orthogonals being indicated in the stonework in the ground, right? And it's solidly linear perspective. It's almost like, hey, look what we can do, linear perspective, ha ha ha. And that almost seems to be the point to this painting, or it's not, but you understand what I mean. So the linear perspective is super dominant. When we get to High Renaissance, we get something like this, which is what we'll study when we get next class, which is the School of Athens. Still in linear perspective, still looks correct to the eye. However, the artist, in this case, Raphael, the artist is not making as big a deal out of it, right? Making a big deal out of linear perspective, understandably so, not making the same big deal about linear perspective in this piece. So we see kind of a freeing from the kind of rigidity that some linear perspective can offer. So when we talk about the High Renaissance, we need to think about again, freedom of thought, the importance of a thinking mind, right? Humanity is dignified and responsible, or belief that they can be, at least. An emphasis placed on both beauty, because there's a high price, high value placed on beauty. In case you haven't noticed that, everybody that we're looking at in the Renaissance, the depiction of the people, they're good looking, right? Emphasis on beauty and individuality, but at the same time, still that order, still rational and order, right? Which is so important to the Renaissance, because it's all about. It's not all about, but it's about pleasing the mind, not just the eye. Okay, that's what I've got for you. Thank you.